I never thought a single sentence could make me question an entire lifetime of being a mother, but that is exactly what happened the day I simply asked if he needed help. It was an ordinary afternoon, nothing dramatic, nothing out of place, the kind of quiet moment that usually passes without memory, and I remember standing in his kitchen, watching him move around with a kind of urgency that did not quite match the situation. Papers were spread across the counter, his phone kept lighting up with messages, and he seemed distracted in a way that made me feel like I should step in the way I always had without thinking twice about it. So I did what I had done for decades. I offered something small, something simple, something that had never once been questioned before. I said I could take care of a few things, give him some space, make things easier for him, and I expected the usual response, maybe a brief thank you, maybe a nod, maybe even a quiet acceptance, because that had always been our pattern. But this time something felt different before he even answered. He did not look at me right away, he did not pause to consider it, and there was a distance in his posture that I could not ignore even if I wanted to. I told myself it was stress, that he had a lot on his mind, that maybe I was reading too much into a moment that did not mean anything, but there was a part of me that had already started to recognize the shift before it fully revealed itself. I stood there waiting, not impatiently, not expecting anything more than a simple response, but the silence stretched just long enough to feel unfamiliar, and when he finally spoke, it did not sound like the voice I had known all these years. It was controlled but cold, direct, but without the usual softness that had always existed between us, no matter how busy life became. In that moment, I realized something was about to be said that I was not prepared for, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it carried a weight that did not belong to the situation we were standing in. I did not move, I did not interrupt, I simply stayed where I was, holding onto the version of this moment that I thought I understood, even as it started to slip away from me. And as I watched him finally turn just enough to acknowledge that I was there, I felt a quiet certainty settle in that whatever he was about to say would not just be about that moment in the kitchen, it would be about something much deeper, something that had been building quietly, without me noticing, until it was too late to change how it would be delivered. He did not turn fully toward me when he answered, and that small detail stayed with me longer than anything else, because it was not just what he said, it was how little of himself he gave to the moment. His shoulders remained angled toward the counter, his hands still moving, as if what I had offered was just another interruption he needed to get past, and not something worth acknowledging. I told myself again that he was busy, that maybe he did not realize how it felt, but there was a distance in his tone that did not match simple distraction. It felt deliberate, even if it was quiet. "I have it handled," he said at first, and those words on their own could have been enough. They could have closed the moment in a way that made sense, and I would have accepted that without a second thought, the way I always had when he needed space. But something in the way he said it made me pause, not because it was rude, but because it felt final in a way that did not leave room for anything else. I stayed where I was, not stepping closer, not stepping away, just holding on to the moment long enough to understand it before I let it pass. I nodded slightly, even though he was not looking at me anymore, and I said that was fine, that I just wanted to make things easier for him. And that was when the silence returned, not long, but heavy enough to feel like something was building again beneath the surface. I watched as he set something down on the counter, a little harder than necessary, not enough to be called frustration, but enough to signal that something inside him was not settled. I could feel the shift coming again, the same way I had a moment earlier, not loud, not obvious, but undeniable once you recognized it. I should have stepped away then. I can see that now. I should have let the first answer stand and walked out of the room with the version of our relationship that still felt intact, but I did not, because I was still holding on to the belief that we were in a normal moment, one that could be adjusted with patience and understanding. I said one more time that I was only trying to help, that it was nothing more than that, and I kept my voice gentle, the way I always had when I wanted him to know that there was no pressure, only support. That was when he finally stopped moving completely, and the stillness that followed felt different from anything that had come before. It was not uncertain, it was decided. He did not rush his next words, he did not raise his voice, he simply let them come out with a clarity that left no space for misunderstanding, and in that brief pause, before he spoke, I realized that whatever he was about to say had been there long before this moment in the kitchen. It had just been waiting for a reason to come out, and I had unknowingly given him that reason. The words did not come out with hesitation, they came out clean and steady, as if they had already been said many times before, just not in front of me. And that was what made them land the way they did. "You have done enough damage already." He did not raise his voice, he did not turn fully toward me, he just said it, and let it exist in the space between us, as if it were a simple fact that did not need to be explained or softened. For a moment, I did not react, not because I did not hear him, but because my mind needed time to catch up to what had just been placed in front of me. Damage. The word stayed there longer than anything else because it did not belong to the moment we were in, it belonged to something much larger, something I had never been told existed. I remained where I was, my hands resting lightly against the edge of the counter, feeling the cool surface beneath my fingers as if grounding myself in something real while everything else shifted. I waited for him to say something more, to clarify, to correct himself, to recognize what he had just said, but nothing followed. Instead, he picked up his phone again, glanced at it briefly, and then turned away, completely taking a step toward the other side of the kitchen as if the conversation had already ended. That was the part that changed everything, not just the words, but the absence of anything after them, no explanation, no hesitation, no acknowledgement that what he had said might require a response. I watched him walk away, not quickly, not angrily, just with a kind of finality that made it clear he was not expecting me to follow or to question him. I did not call his name, I did not ask what he meant, I did not even move from where I was, because something inside me understood that whatever answer I might ask for would not change what had already been revealed. The room felt quieter than it had before, not because the sounds had stopped, but because my awareness of them had shifted completely, everything else fading behind the weight of that one sentence. I looked down at my hands for a moment, noticing how still they were, and I realized that the reaction I had expected from myself was not coming. There was no immediate anger, no instinct to defend myself, just a slow and steady understanding taking shape. This was not about a misunderstanding or a moment of frustration. This was something he believed, something that had been there long enough to come out without hesitation when given the chance. And as I stood there alone in the same space where I had just offered help, I understood that the moment had already passed into something else, something that could not be undone simply by asking what he meant or hoping he would take it back, because some words once spoken do not ask to be taken back. They simply reveal what has been true all along. For a few seconds after he walked away, I stayed exactly where I was, not because I did not know what to do, but because I needed to understand what had just happened without reacting to it too quickly. The word he used did not fade the way ordinary words do. It stayed present as if it had been placed there deliberately, waiting to be acknowledged in full. Damage. I repeated it silently, not questioning it, not rejecting it, just letting it exist long enough for me to see what it meant in the context of everything that had come before. I looked around the kitchen, noticing the same details I had seen 100 times before: the arrangement of the dishes, the light coming in through the window, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, and yet everything felt slightly different, not because anything had physically changed, but because my understanding of my place in that space had shifted. I moved slowly, then not in reaction to him, but in response to myself, stepping away from the counter and taking a few measured steps toward the doorway without any urgency. I did not follow him. I did not try to continue the conversation because I understood that nothing I said in that moment would reach him in the way it needed to. Whatever he believed had already been formed and spoken, and it did not require my agreement to exist. I paused briefly at the edge of the room, turning my head just enough to see him in the distance, still moving through his own tasks, as if nothing significant had just taken place, and that image settled something inside me with a clarity that I had not expected. This was not a moment he would revisit. This was not something he would come back to explain or reconsider. It was something he had accepted as truth and acted on without hesitation. I did not feel the need to defend myself, not because I agreed, but because I recognized that this was not a misunderstanding that could be corrected with explanation. It was a belief that had been allowed to grow without my awareness. I stepped out of the kitchen, then into the quiet hallway, the sound of my own footsteps steady and unhurried, and I realized that the absence of immediate emotion was not emptiness, it was clarity forming in real time. I did not need to ask what damage he meant. I did not need to list everything I had done or remind him of the years that had come before, because none of that would change what had already been revealed. As I continued down the hallway, I understood something that I had not fully seen until that moment, that sometimes the most important shift does not happen in the person who speaks, but in the person who hears and chooses how to carry what has been said. And as I reached the end of the hall and paused there for just a second, I realized that I was no longer standing in the same place I had been a few minutes earlier, not physically, but in the way I understood my role in his life. And that realization did not come with noise or resistance, it came quietly, with a certainty that would not be undone. As I walked further down the hallway, I noticed how quiet everything felt, not in a way that was unfamiliar, but in a way that made every small detail more defined, as if the absence of conversation had made space for something clearer to take its place. I did not rush, I did not stop, I simply moved at a steady pace, allowing my thoughts to settle into something that no longer needed to be questioned. The word he had used was still there, but it no longer felt sharp, it felt settled, like something that had already found its place in the truth of the situation. I reached the living room and paused for a moment, not because I was unsure of what to do next, but because I recognized that this was where I would decide how I would carry what had just happened forward. I looked around the space, taking in the familiar arrangement of furniture, the soft light coming through the windows, and the quiet sense of order that had always made this place feel like home, and I realized that nothing here had changed except the way I now understood my role within it. I sat down slowly in the chair near the window, placing my hands gently in my lap, and for the first time since the moment in the kitchen, I allowed myself to reflect not on what I had done, but on what I had assumed for all these years. I had always believed that offering help was an extension of care, that being present and involved meant I was supporting him in the way a mother should, but now I could see that somewhere along the way that meaning had shifted without my awareness. What I saw as support, he may have come to see as interference. What I believed was guidance, he may have interpreted as something else entirely, and while I did not agree with that perspective, I could no longer ignore that it existed. I did not feel the need to correct it immediately. I did not feel the urge to return to the kitchen and ask for clarification, because I understood that this was not something that would be resolved through explanation alone. This was something that required a different kind of response, one that did not rely on repeating old patterns in the hope that they would be understood differently this time. I sat there quietly, letting that realization take its full shape, and I noticed that what I felt was not loss in the way I might have expected, but a kind of separation forming between what had been and what would need to be going forward. I was no longer holding on to the assumption that my role remained the same simply because it always had been, and that shift did not come with resistance, it came with a calm acceptance that something had changed, whether I had chosen it or not. As I looked out the window and watched the stillness outside, I understood that the next step was not about fixing what had been said or proving that it was wrong. It was about deciding how I would move forward with the clarity I now had. And that decision did not need to be rushed, because for the first time I was no longer reacting to what someone else had said, I was choosing what it meant for me. The longer I sat there, the more I realized that nothing inside me was pushing me to go back and continue the conversation, and that in itself was something new, because for most of my life, I would have gone back, I would have asked questions, I would have tried to understand and fix whatever had created distance between us. But this time there was no urgency, no pull to restore what had just been broken, because I could see clearly that it had not broken in that moment, it had only been revealed. I leaned back slightly in the chair, letting the stillness settle around me, and I noticed how steady my breathing felt, how calm everything inside me had become. Not because I was unaffected, but because I was no longer trying to hold on to something that had already shifted. I thought about all the small moments over the years when I had stepped in without being asked, when I had offered help assuming it was needed and welcomed, and I could see now how easily those moments could have been interpreted differently, depending on where someone stood. I did not regret them because they came from a place of care, but I also understood now that care given without invitation can eventually feel like something else entirely to the person receiving it. That realization did not feel like blame, it felt like clarity, something that allowed me to see both sides without needing to argue for either one. I sat there quietly, letting that understanding settle into something stable, and I realized that what mattered most was not whether he was right or wrong, but what I chose to do with what I had learned. I could not go back and change how he saw the past, and I could not force him to explain something he had already made clear, so the only thing left was to decide how I would move forward without repeating the same pattern that had led us here. I placed my hands gently on the arms of the chair and sat there for a moment longer, not thinking about what I had lost, but about what I was no longer responsible for carrying. I was no longer responsible for anticipating his needs before he expressed them. I was no longer responsible for stepping in to fix things that were not offered to me, and I was no longer responsible for maintaining a role that had already been redefined without my awareness. That understanding did not feel heavy, it felt like something had been set down after being carried for a long time without question. I looked toward the hallway leading back to the kitchen, and I did not feel the need to return there, not because I was avoiding it, but because there was nothing left there that required my presence in the same way it had before. I remained where I was, grounded in the quiet certainty that had taken its place, and I understood that this was the point where things truly changed, not in the words that had been spoken, but in the way I was choosing to respond to them. And that response was no longer automatic, it was intentional, and that made all the difference. I stayed in that chair longer than I realized, not because I was lost in thought, but because I was allowing the silence to finish what the conversation had started, and for the first time, I did not feel the need to fill it with anything else. The house felt different now, not in structure, not in sound, but in meaning, as if something that had always been assumed was no longer quietly holding everything together. I listened to the faint movements coming from the kitchen, the opening of a cabinet, the sound of something being set down, and it all continued, as if nothing significant had happened, which only made it clearer that for him nothing had changed, because in his mind this had already been settled long before I heard it. I did not take that personally in the way I might have before, because I understood now that his reaction was not about that single moment, it was the result of something that had been building without being addressed. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands together, and I realized that there was a kind of freedom in not needing to respond immediately, not needing to defend or explain or correct anything that had been said. The responsibility I had always felt to maintain harmony, to keep things smooth, to step in before anything became difficult, was no longer sitting on my shoulders in the same way, and without that weight, I could see the situation more clearly than I ever had before. I was not being pushed away in that moment. I had already been standing at a distance without recognizing it, and what he said had simply made that distance visible. I thought about how many times I had stepped in over the years, how many decisions I had helped guide, how often I had assumed that my involvement was expected and welcomed, and I could see now that those assumptions had never been questioned out loud, but they had not remained unchanged either. There was no bitterness in that realization, only a quiet acknowledgement that roles can shift even when no one announces it, and if you do not notice the shift, you continue acting in a way that no longer fits the situation. I sat there feeling the calm settle deeper, not because everything was resolved, but because I no longer felt the need to resolve it in the same way I once would have. I was not waiting for him to come back into the room. I was not expecting an apology or a conversation that would restore what had been there before, because I understood that what mattered now was not what he chose to say next, but what I chose to do with what had already been said. I turned my head slightly toward the window again, letting my attention rest on something outside of the house, and I noticed how steady everything felt, how unchanged the world continued to be beyond that moment, and it reminded me that not everything needed to be carried forward just because it had been spoken. I remained there, grounded in that understanding, and I realized that I was not holding on to the past version of my role anymore. I was standing in a new one that had formed without my permission, but was now fully within my control to define moving forward, and that realization did not feel like loss. It felt like something had been clarified in a way that would not be undone. I did not feel the need to return to the kitchen even as time passed, and the sounds of movement continued, because something inside me had already shifted into a place that no longer required my presence there to feel complete. I remained seated for a while longer, not out of hesitation, but because I understood that the moment I stood up again, it would not be to continue what had been interrupted, it would be to move forward in a different way entirely. When I finally rose from the chair, I did so slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I was aware of the change in how I was carrying myself, even in something as simple as standing. There was no rush, no urgency to fix or restore anything, just a steady awareness that I was no longer stepping back into the same role I had always assumed without question. I walked toward the hallway again, my steps even and unforced, and as I passed by the entrance to the kitchen, I did not stop. I did not look in, and I did not announce that I was leaving that space behind, because there was no need to make a statement out of something that was already clear. I continued through the house, moving past familiar rooms that now felt slightly different, not because they had changed, but because I was no longer viewing them through the same expectations. I picked up my bag from the chair near the door, my movements simple and deliberate, and for a brief moment I stood there with my hand resting lightly on the strap, considering nothing in particular, just acknowledging that this was the point where I chose how to carry everything forward. I did not feel anger, I did not feel the need to revisit the words or challenge them, because their purpose had already been fulfilled. They had shown me something I could not ignore, and once seen it, did not require repetition. I reached for the door handle and paused for a second, not because I was waiting for him to call out or come after me, but because I was aware of the quiet finality in the choice I was making. I opened the door and stepped outside into the open air, the shift in atmosphere immediate and grounding as the space around me widened in a way that felt steady and clear. I closed the door gently behind me, not out of caution, but out of habit, and I stood there for a moment, letting the stillness settle again, noticing how different it felt when I was no longer inside the space where those words had been spoken. I did not look back right away because there was nothing inside that required my attention in that moment, not out of distance, but out of understanding. When I finally began to walk forward, I did so without hesitation, not because I knew exactly what would come next, but because I no longer needed to define it immediately. What mattered had already been decided, not by him, but by me, in the way I had chosen to respond, not with reaction, but with clarity, and that clarity moved with me as I stepped away from the version of myself that had always stepped in and towards something quieter, stronger, and entirely my own. I walked a little farther down the quiet street before I slowed my steps. Not because I was tired, but because I could feel the full weight of the moment settling into something steady and complete inside me. The air felt different out there, open and undisturbed, and for the first time since that sentence had been spoken, I allowed myself to fully understand what it meant without trying to reshape it into something easier to carry. He had said I had done damage, and whether I agreed or not was no longer the point, because what mattered was that he believed it strongly enough to say it without hesitation and then walk away, as if it required no further thought. I did not follow him then, and I would not follow that version of the conversation now, because I understood something with a clarity that left no room for doubt, that the role I had been holding on to for years no longer existed in the way I thought it did. I continued walking slowly, my steps even and grounded, and I noticed how quiet my mind felt, not empty, but settled, as if something that had been unclear for a long time had finally been brought into focus. I was no longer replaying the moment. I was no longer searching for a different outcome or a better response, because there was nothing to correct. There was only something to accept and then move forward from. I thought about the many times I had stepped in without being asked, the times I believed I was helping without question, and I could see now that what I had considered natural had not always been received that way, and that did not make either of us entirely right or wrong. It simply meant that something had gone unspoken for too long. But now it had been spoken, and I could not return to not knowing it. I stopped for a moment at the corner, looking out across the quiet street, and I realized that I was not carrying anger with me. I was carrying understanding, and that made all the difference, because understanding does not demand a reaction. It creates space for a decision. I did not need to go back and explain myself. I did not need to ask him to take back what he had said, because none of that would change the fact that something between us had already shifted into a new place. What I could do was decide how I would stand in that new place without losing myself in it, and that decision came to me without effort, without resistance. I would no longer step in where I was not invited. I would no longer assume that my presence was needed simply because it always had been, and I would no longer measure my worth by how much I could give without being asked. I turned slightly and continued walking forward, not away from him, but towards something that belonged entirely to me, a quieter understanding of where I stood and what I would carry from this moment on. And as I moved forward with that clarity, I realized that nothing had been taken from me in that kitchen. It had only been revealed. And once something is seen that clearly, it cannot be unseen. It can only be accepted and lived with differently. And that was exactly what I was choosing to do.